Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Ms. Joanne Smith of the London Fire Brigade. So would you ask Ms. Smith to come in, please? Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Smith.
Good morning, sir.
Yes, do sit down, make yourself comfortable.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Millett, when you're ready.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Good morning to you. Good morning, members of the panel. Good morning, Ms. Smith.
Good morning.
Now, before I pick up the reins again where we were on Thursday afternoon, I just want to ask you one or two additional questions about something you said about a database last Thursday. Can I take you back, please, to the transcript for day 202 at page 50? If you go to line 15, you said this, and I'll just show you what you said. Every FSG call was captured on a database. So we had a database for all our fire survival guidance calls, and when a control operator took a fire survival guidance call, the supervisor or the operations manager would enter the details onto that database. So they were always listened to routinely. Whoever was the duty brigade control senior managers would have done that on duty at the time, and often we would have listened to them together in the control room. We shared an office, so Lindsay and I would listen to them together. It wasn't unusual that Scott was also in there too, but this was specifically to do with high-rise incidents, and I listened to all high-rise calls, some of which were fire survival guidance and had fire survival guidance calls in them. Now, what I want to do, if I may briefly, is to look and see what you understood to be the database. Can I ask you, please, to be shown LFB 3031757? And what will come up will need to be opened in its native form. Now, that is a document that we discovered called, with its file name, FSG database. Can we keep that on the screen, but also have displayed at the same time LFB 000072996? This is an email. Thank you. This is an email from you to. So sorry, we're trying to show both at the same time. We can just leave it with the email. We'll be fine. Just display the email, and we'll go back to the spreadsheet in a moment. Thank you. This is an email from you, Ms. Smith, to Andrea Scheuer. Subject call data, dated the 16th of May 2017. Hi, Andrea. Hope the journey back was easier and much improved with junk food. Attached is the FSG database we spoke about, so have a look through and let us know if anything interesting appeals. Now, Andrea Scheuer is, I think, so far as we can tell, at Portsmouth University.
She is, yes.
Or was. And if we have the database document back up on the screen, please, LFB 000031757. Was that the document you were sending her on the 16th of May 2017, do you think?
That could possibly be it.
Yes? Why were you sending it to her?
Because we had been working with Portsmouth University for a number of years, really. I'd been introduced to the university when I was working on national operational guidance for control. And they were undertaking a piece of work with Hampshire Fire, I believe, and another fire and rescue service control room, just about engagement with a caller and best practice.
Now, if we look at this document, we can see that the first two columns are date of call, time of call, reading across the blue strip at the top, incident number, which has been redacted out, and an incident description. And then if you look at 5 columns along, if we can scroll along a little bit further, please, you come to operator surname, which is also redacted out. But normally, would that contain the name of the CRO who took the FSG call?
I believe so, yes.
Then if you look 7 columns along from that, you can see there's a densely populated column entitled Notes, Stroke Comments, Stroke Observations. Would that normally contain an abstract or short description of the event, the incident?
Yes.
And the next column, created, is the date. That would be that would be, is this right, the date in which the description of the incident to the left of it was inserted?
Yes, possibly the observations, the date the observations were made.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the identity of the creator in column R, yes?
Yes.
And those individuals you can see listed there, Yvonne Woodhams, Chris Bobby, were they AOMs?
They are OMs, but there are some AOMs on there, so it could have been entered by either or.
Right, either or. So would that tell us that they were the supervisors in the control room at the time of the incident in question?
Yes, I would imagine so.
Now, was this the FSG database that you were referring to when you gave the evidence I've read out to you last week?
Yes, it looks like it. It's in a different format when you add the data in, but obviously this is the raw data, so.
How would a supervisor decide to add an FSG call to the database? When I say how, what would impel a supervisor to decide to add an FSG call to the database? Or was it that all FSG calls were put into this database?
So I believe all FSG calls were captured in this database.
Now, if you look at the commentary, the notes commentary, line 73, if we go down to line 73, I think we have to go back to the left-hand column. If we go back to the... Yes, if you go back to the left-hand column, you can see that it corresponds with the 6th of October 2013. That's the earliest date that on this document we have detailed observations of or from the incident. Do you know why that is?
No, I can just imagine it's probably just to do with a change of IT system, and the previous document where we recorded FSG calls is stored somewhere else. I just would have sent some current ones to Andrea.
Right. If we scroll down slowly, you can see that in fact the dates of this document roll back earlier than October 2013. They go back, in fact, I think as far back as 2009. If you scroll down a little bit lower than that, you can see it goes into 2009 and indeed 2008. So does that tell us that even before Lacanal, you were keeping this database in some form?
Yes.
I see. And in that form, were notes, comments, observations also entered?
Yes, they were.
I see. So this just tells us that there was some sort of IT change. Is this right? So that this database only records those inputted after October 2013?
I can only guess.
Right.
I wouldn't have extracted the data myself, so I would have asked someone to do it, probably from OST. So,
how are the details of the FSG review recorded between 2009, say, and 2013? Was it in a document like this?
It was exactly the same process. There's a Microsoft Access database that the supervisors just add an entry to in, and there are some specific fields to complete.
If there were multiple calls to one incident, would there be a different row created for each call?
Yes, I believe so.
Can we look at line 21, please, scrolling right back up to an incident on the 31st of October 2015, line 21. There are a number of numbers allocated to this incident. This appears to be Adair Tower. Line 21, and if we can scroll across to the comments column, please. it says this was one of 9 FSG calls to a fire in a high-rise. Dominique spoke to the occupant, redacted, for 14 minutes until she was rescued from a bedroom at the rear of the flat. Dominique calmed, redacted, and passed exact directions to the bedroom from the front door of the flat and stayed on the line with her until the firefighters rescued her. Dominique stayed focused and professional throughout the call, and her actions directly influenced a successful outcome. Would you agree that, first of all, do you agree that this is the Adair Tower fire? If we can scroll back across to
Yes.
the left-hand side, we can...
Yes, if it correlates to the incident date, yes.
Yes, and it appears that certainly in the database there were 9 FSG calls for Adair Tower.
Yes, well, that would correlate with the debrief that the operations manager wrote as well.
What was the purpose of adding this feedback to the database? I picked Adair as an example, not just because of the 9, but because of the quality of the observations. But looking at that as typical, what was the purpose of adding that feedback to the database?
I think that was just the initial comments by the supervisor.
And how would a supervisor go about assessing the performance of Dominique?
Well, there could be several reasons. A, they could have been supervising them directly, so they could have overheard. B, they could have listened to the call after, and they could have spoken to the control officer. So I would imagine a range of ways.
Would Dominique have used any particular criteria or policy against which to assess the call?
The call taker, Dominique, or the supervisor?
The supervisor.
Would the supervisor? I would have expected them to use the 4 principles plus reassess when they were assessing that. But I think this is just a general, as you can see, some comments are very large and others are less detailed. So I can imagine that was just their initial feedback.
I see. You're right. I muddled Dominique, who's the call taker, with the relevant supervisor. Yeah, but my question is, and building on the answer you've just given me, when the supervisor was assessing the call, would they be working from a fixed set of principles in a policy or guidance document, or would they just be assessing the quality of the call from their own experience?
From their own experience, but also they have had training in the 4 principles, so I wouldn't have expected them to use a guidance document to do that.
Right. You mentioned other feedback a moment ago. Would there be other feedback recorded elsewhere other than this database?
No, not other than this database, but as I said, whoever was the duty Brigade Control Senior Manager would also have access to this database and would have also have gone in and reviewed those calls.
Right. Would this feedback, whether the one for Adair Tower or indeed any that we can see on the screen in this database, be used as the basis of training for CROs in call handling going forward?
It certainly does now, but I'm not sure that it did in 2016, 2017.
Right. Would any negative or critical feedback be recorded in this database? We haven't found any.
No. I don't know, but like I said, I wasn't any of the supervisors that entered the information.
Right. And once the database for the particular incident had been recorded and finalised in the way in which we see here, what use would be made of that information thereafter?
In terms of the Brigade Control Senior Manager just reviewing the information, do you mean?
Well, it would sit there on the database.
Yes.
What would it be used for? Who would look at it? Why would they look at it? What would they do with it?
So Brigade Senior Managers would look at it and listen to the calls, and then if they identified any issues, then they would speak to the Operations Manager. It also may be used for a PRC or, in fact, a local debrief that Control ran separately. So it would be used and it would be referred to. And it might, if there were some trends be placed into training, it might give us some cause for concern, or it might give us and identify some really good practice, which we would use as well. So I can't see any from there specifically, but we have referred to it, and it is a useful database.
Yes, thank you. And I want to go back, if I may please, to where we left off on Thursday evening and turn to a different topic, which is prompts in Policy 539 about whether a caller is a person who is vulnerable or is with a person who is vulnerable. Now, can we start, please, with your witness statement at paragraph 40 on page 16? The question there is whether guidance should be given to CROs in order to establish whether a caller is or is with a person who is disabled, has poor mobility, or otherwise would require assistance in the event of an evacuation. You say, by way of response there, I do not recall this specifically being a feature of the review of PN 539. However, I do recall that this was referenced in training and RIF documents over the years. Now, just pausing there, do you agree that it is important for Policy 539 to contain information, or guidance at least, that specifies that when a caller is taking a call, especially a fast survival guidance call, the call handler should ask for information about whether that individual or a person with them has an impairment or would require assistance in the event of evacuation?
I think it's important, and it's part of their general call handling skills anyway, but I do take your point that it would be important to put it in there when dealing with fire survival guidance.
Now let's look then at the 2007 version of Policy 539. This is at LFB 000028382. Let's just have the first page up there to identify it. Can we then go to page 20 within it? This is Appendix 1, Fire Survival Guidance, and if you scroll down the screen, please, you can see the prompt questions, and it's about 2/3 of the way down the page, about just over halfway down your screen. The question is, does the caller have any disability that may affect them carrying out any of these actions? And these actions are the ones that are referred to before that. Now, paragraph, we keep that on the screen, but if we can go then to paragraph 41 of your witness statement, you say there, Appendix 3 of the revised policy number 539 also sets out the importance of the escape and assess limbs of the four-part guidance, escape, assess, protect, reassess. Whilst this does not specifically refer to a person's mobility, I would expect a CRO to consider a person's mobility when contemplating an escape route and assessing the situation as a whole. Now, you've picked up the point there that the amended version, which was amended in September 2010, as we saw on Thursday, omitted any reference in what had become Appendix 3, the FSG section, to the disability question. Do you know why the September 2010 version of the FSG guidance in Policy 539 omitted the reference to disability which had been expressed in the version it was amending?
I don't know. I'm unclear of who updated the policy in 2010. I think I had some involvement in the update in 2011, but not in the 2010 update. And I think that I commented previously on some of the other training materials to make sure that those questions were in. So the training document, and I believe it was in the reference information file as well.
Yeah. Who was involved, or who authorised the 2010 update?
I don't know.
You don't know. Did you ever come to hear of a decision being made to omit the reference to disability from the 2010 version?
No.
Did you ever go back to check that the amended version matched the guidance in the Home Office's fire service circulars?
No, like I say, I know that I had commented on previous training documents to make sure that that information was in. I know it was in the RIF to support staff, but as I said, a part of their general call handling training and just in general when they take calls on a daily basis, those are questions that they would encounter when dealing with people trapped in a range of situations.
So would it follow from that you can't help us about whether anybody went and checked the 2010 version against the 2007 version to see if anything had been accidentally omitted?
No.
Now, if we look at Fire Service Circular 5404, which was the Fire Service Circular identified in the gap analysis but not looked at as part of the gap analysis, that's at LFB 000-55201. If we go to page 16 in that document, this is Annex D, fire call prompts. It has 3 stages. Stage 1, you see stage 1, stage 2, and then if you go, please, to page 17, stage 3, fire survival guidance, and then in the box, the third box down, assess the situation, and then under that you see the second box down, assess the caller, and then you can see age, gender, ethnicity, mental or physical disability. You see that?
Yes.
And then protect the caller and assist rescue. Given the specific step that this circular from 2004 demands, particularly asking for details on age, gender, ethnicity, and mental and physical disability, can you tell us why neither you or particularly anybody in the brigade, it appears, checked this document to see whether it was covered in Policy 539, at least when it was amended in 2010?
So not 5404, because I think as LFB had taken a decision not to use that document prior to my arrival of joining LFB. But I know those are points that are picked up in 1093 as well, and I'm surprised that no one went back to check that Policy 539 aligned with
Right.
that.
And indeed, even after 2011, it never had that in it, did it?
No.
No. Do you know why that is?
I don't. I can only imagine that because we had covered it in the training, because it was in the RIF and the documents that a control officer accesses during a fire survival guidance call, that we felt that that was sufficient. And like I say, it's not unusual on any call when they're talking to a caller to assess the caller and the caller's age and capabilities of exiting a building or a vehicle, if you like.
Now, not unusual rather suggests that it's left to the habits and practice of the call handler to let the caller volunteer this information. Is that how it worked?
I'm not sure that it's left to the operator. I think most fire control officers would say that the caller would offer such information up, because when they're engaging with the caller, they would provide, or we would ask and provide some advice or guidance, and they would come back with a reason why they couldn't do that. So I think that is part of the practice, but it's very much dependent on the information that the caller gives as to what the control officer asks after that.
But under this national guidance, do you accept that the national guidance doesn't leave it to be dependent on the information that the caller gives? It puts the burden on the call handler actually to make a positive assessment of the caller in these 4 respects.
Yes.
Yes.
Do.
And therefore, do you accept this? If you're leaving it to the the conversation, if you like, between the call handler and the caller, so that these details will or might not emerge, then you're not following national guidance, which requires a positive assessment.
Yes, I certainly would agree with LFB weren't following National Guidance 5404.
Was there a decision made, to the best of your recollection, by the Brigade, that even though national guidance required an assessment of the caller positively to be made by the call handler, the LFB wasn't going to require its call handlers to do so?
No, as I said on Thursday, we had looked when we were investigating and the Lacanau file, we had looked for any decision that had been taken by LFB not to adopt 5404, but we couldn't find it. But conversely, there was never any literature or information that we were using 5404.
When you did your gap analysis, did you identify the fact that even though 5404 had a positive requirement on the call handler to assess the caller in these four respects, 1093 and the Home Office document Keeping People Safe from 1994 did not have anything in it to the effect that the call handler should assess the caller?
I was under the impression that it did have something in there about assessing the caller and being aware of any caller vulnerabilities.
There is, well, I don't want to take up your time or the panel's time going back through those documents, but and we can read those for ourselves. But do you recall, is it in your mind, that the 1993 guidance and the 1994 Keeping People Safe guidance did require an assessment of the caller in addition to an assessment of the caller's situation?
Yes.
You did think that?
I did think that.
Right. When you did your gap analysis, did you actually specifically examine that question just to make sure that there was nothing in the 2004 guidance that wasn't exactly reflected in the 1993 and 1994 guidance?
No, I think the decision was taken that we would not use 2004, that we would use 1093.
Can we then go to LFB 401255, please? This is GRA 3.2, Fighting Fires in High-Rise Buildings, and this is the version from the 28th of February 2014, although you can't see it on the page. If we go to page 20 in this document, at the top of the screen it says, in the second paragraph, fire and rescue authorities must also have effective arrangements in place to handle fire survival guidance calls from residents and others when they believe they are unable to leave the building due to disability, poor mobility, illness, or the affects of fire. Now first, do you remember reading GRA 3.2 when it came out in February 2014?
No, I didn't know of its existence until phase 1 of the inquiry.
You didn't know of its existence?
No.
Right. So does it follow from that, and I think it would follow from that you never yourself reflected whether Appendix 3 of Policy 539 after September 2010 itself reflected GRA 3.2, namely to ensure that there were effective arrangements in place to handle FSG calls for those who are under these vulnerabilities?
No, I don't.
Do you know whether anybody else in the Brigade did that exercise?
In terms of the impact for control?
Yes.
No, I don't.
Are you able to explain how it comes about that LFB's own policies on fire survival guidance call did not reflect national guidance, to this extent at least, in GRE 3.2 in respect of persons under a disability with poor mobility or illness? No,
and like I say, I wasn't aware of the existence of this document and how it would impact control. And no one ever made me aware of it.
No. Does that surprise you?
Yes.
Can we look, please, at the 2014 version of Policy 539? This is at LFB 50737, and I'd like to go with you, please, to page 22. and at the top of the page it says Document History Assessments, and then it says an equality, sustainability or health, safety and welfare impact assessment and or risk assessment was last completed on, and you see EIA 17th of September 2008. Now an EIA is an equality impact assessment, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Can you help us with why, after Policy 539 was updated by the Brigade on the 3rd of September, and I think with your input on the 3rd of February 2011, it wasn't subject to another equality impact assessment?
No, I can't.
Should it have been?
It looks like it, yes. It was certainly something that I was never asked to complete or had seen one attached to this document.
Who was responsible, so far as control was concerned, at this policy, particularly for ensuring that an EIA was completed once the policy had been through significant amendment?
I would imagine it would have been the document owner.
The document owner, if we go to page 1, we can see the document owner. Head of Operational Response, who in March 2014 was who?
Dave Brown.
Dave Brown. Thank you very much. That's AC Brown. Can I then turn to a different topic, which is language? Can we go back to your witness statement, please, page 17, paragraph 42? Now, you say here, there's a long series of questions before this, but at the top of the page, whether guidance should be given to CROs with regard to communicating with callers whose first language is not English. And you say, CROs can use language line for any call received, not just FSG calls. Reference to language line is included in paragraphs 4.7 and 4.8 of policy number 539. I also recall that there were some updates to language line in 2018, and language line came into control to deliver training on this to CROs. I do not have access to this particular presentation to exhibit, as it was provided by language line. Let's look at policy 539, and particularly the paragraphs to which you refer there. LFB 50737 again, and again this is the version current as at 2014, signed off by AC Dave Brown. And if we can go to page 4, you see the paragraphs you refer to, 4.7, 4.8, under the heading Interpreter Service.
Yes.
And I'll just look at those with you. English may not be the first language of a person attempting to pass an emergency call. Agreements are in place for the use of an interpreter service language line. Now, are you able to explain why the policy did not set out any instructions on how to speak to persons whose first language was not English?
Just like the details in this policy, it really would have depended. So there were some technical processes that control officers needed to follow. So that's why it isn't in there and is in a reference information file.
Right. There's no guidance or policy here as to how to get hold of an interpreter rapidly, is there?
No, that would have been in the RIF, and they would have all had training on language line and how to access language line, so they would know that.
Right. Did you yourself review this part of the policy when you were reviewing it in February 2011?
No, I think we did have a conversation about if there were any other services that we could use to provide, but the decision was taken to continue to use language line.
Right. Now, using language line, I mean, how would it work? A caller rings.
Yes.
And they are speaking a language that the call handler simply does not recognise.
Yes.
Whatever it is. What do they do?
So the control officer tries to engage with them to make them understand that we will contact an interpreter service, and then they are able to dial the number whilst on the phone to the caller, and they are connected to language line, who can then listen in and find out the caller's language and then provide an interpretation service for that.
I see. And the interpretation service would be immediately on hand, would it? So, for example, you had a caller who could only speak Amharic or Tagalog. Would that be immediately?
I'm not sure it was immediate, no.
Right.
And I think when we looked originally, and I have explored this since with the University of Portsmouth, I don't believe anyone has an immediate interpreter service and offers an immediate interpreter service. You're right, it takes time to understand what language they are speaking and find a suitable interpreter for them.
Can you give us an impression of how much time?
From the calls that we use Language Line for, and they are infrequent, so I would say about 10 a month, 5 to 6 minutes on average.
Right. I want to turn to a different topic altogether, which is Action 9, a revision of the RIFs, Reference Information Files. Can we go, as we do, to the starting point, which is the Lakenal House Incident Assurance Review from August 2018 at LFB 404801. And in that document, please, let's go to page 13, Action 9, on the right-hand side at the bottom of the screen. And the action is revise the reference information file used by control officers when delivering fire survival guidance in order to ensure that they comply with national guidance. If we go to your witness statement at paragraph 26, page 11, you say, I was involved in the first revision of the FSG RIFs or RIFs for CROs and the introduction of supervisor RIFs. Now, Scott Hayward said in his evidence that the RIFs were revised by Lindsay Turner and the OST, the Operational Support Team. Is that correct?
So I think prior to our gap analysis, they were the RIF that Scott was referring to as current at the time of Lakenal, and that was updated by OST. Because it was a technical process to load them onto the mobilising system, OST would have been involved in the layout and the construction of the RIFs, and it would have been down to one of the SOMs to sign off the content of that.
And which SOM was that?
So I believe it was Lindsay during the Lakenal fire, but the revised version in September 2010 was myself.
Right, so fine. So when you say I was involved in the first revision, you signed off on not just the technical aspects of the RIF, but actually the substantive content.
Yes.
Now, you go on to say, in the second sentence there, I recall that in September 2010, I proposed a redraft of the RIFs. I recall that Scott Hayward and I discussed the types of useful information to obtain from callers and therefore to put onto the RIF. What was Scott Hayward's role in revising the RIF?
So I think that was just as from the lessons that we'd learnt from Lakenal, we were very focused on one of the gaps, which was about proactive questioning, and that we should provide some proactive questionings. And I think from those discussions, I redrafted the RIF so it contained examples of proactive questionings for different building types.
And what was his role?
He would have known that I was doing that. He may have had a look through it, but it was just as I would have discussed it with him or Tim Cutbull at the time or Tom Davis, it was part of some of the gap analysis that we had identified. And
this was, to be clear, this was CRO RIFs, was it? Not only the supervisor RIFs, but
no,
the CRO
CRO RIF.
And who had ultimately responsibility for the contents of the CRO RIF? Was that you or was that Scott Hayward?
So OST would have created it on what we had requested. They would have designed it, they would have uploaded it on the system and put that I'd signed off on it. But that would have been a group decision on the content.
Yes. And in terms of hierarchy, at least, that would have been a sign-off by you, but subject to the ultimate approval or authority of Scott Hayward. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm not sure that the detail of each RIF he would have been familiar with or what we were putting in the RIF, but...
Was it approved or reviewed by AC Dave Brown?
I'm not sure, and I'm not sure if it went to the Lacanal board at the time. I know there was some discussion and some scrutiny over our RIFs,
Yes.
so I'm not sure if it was presented there or just they accepted that we had updated it.
Right. And what about the training department? Do they see it? Have any input into the contents?
LFB training?
Yes.
No.
Right. And you don't know whether it was put before the Lacanal board. I think the minutes that we've got tell us that there were updates given. We have one from September 2010 saying that the RIF had been reworked to complement the FSG package. Just for our own benefit, that's LFB 3055192 at page 2, paragraph 5.6. That's a point of detail for us. But does that accord with your recollection?
Yes, and I know there was some conversations had during that time, because obviously we wanted to make sure that we were covering a range of building types, and that's how we were laying the RIF out, and therefore we'd engaged with other departments in LFB about some advice and guidance for, as it says there, commercial buildings.
Was there a training package that was going to be delivered to CROs in order to roll out the revised RIFs to them?
I don't think so. In September 2011, I don't think there was a training package. I think we uploaded them, we communicated it with staff and asked them to familiarise themselves with it. It was a long document, but it did have hyperlinks in it, so the idea was that when you thought you were taking a fire survival guidance call, that you could actually click on the building type where the caller was, and that would take you to the specifics.
Right. In paragraph 26, you go on to say, just below halfway down, both of these individuals, that's John Bradbury and Jim Knighton, then also attended and observed the subsequent FSG training in June 2011 to ensure all gaps identified in the gap analysis were addressed. Did that include the training on the new RIFs?
I wouldn't imagine that.
You wouldn't imagine?
I wouldn't imagine that was training on the RIFs, no. The RIF is just an aid memoir there for control officers, but I would imagine that the RIF was aligned, so the training and the RIF were aligned.
The training and the RIF were aligned. So
Yeah.
does that tell us that you, although you amended the RIFs, you didn't actually put in place a formal training package or PowerPoint or slideshow to the CROs to show them what the changes were and take them through it in a structured and organised way?
No,
Right.
and that wouldn't have been the case for any RIF, really, that that they had access to.
Why is that?
Just because it is an aid memoir, and it is there just for their reference. Some RIFs contain a lot of technical information, and maybe the operators will look at them from time to time just because they've forgotten a process on the system, and other RIFs will contain some detail and maybe some questioning to ask if they get stuck or want that to help. So in terms of training, they would have been trained on how to access the suite of reference information files, but just being told that the reference information file had been updated, they could have accessed that at any time. They could have looked through that. It was quite clear and concise. It wasn't in a different format. It hadn't changed layout, and it was aligned to what we had told them in their training, I believe, in terms of proactive questioning and assessing, and the 4 principles and reassess.
Would you accept that without a specific presentation or training package to take the CROs through the revised RIF, you couldn't be sure that they had all fully understood the nature and extent of the changes, and that therefore there was a risk that they would still be handling calls based on their old knowledge.
No, no, I don't agree with that. I don't think that training on a RIF would have benefited them anymore. They had FSG training in 2010. That was followed in 2011 as well. They would have been aware of all the changes we'd introduced, and the RIF, like I say, is just an aid memoir to support them should they need it.
If we turn to page 27 of your statement on page 12, you say, by January 2011, we had produced a final redraft of the FSG RIFs, and this update, I think I should say, was passed on to all CROs. We amended the FSG RIFs to cover a multitude of building types so that the advice could be tailored for different types of buildings. I recall that we created a separate RIF for domestic dwellings, high-rise buildings, commercial properties and HMOs. I understand that Vic Bagnall subsequently removed the references to multiple building types in the FSG RIF during my secondment to CFOA.
So sorry, just to be clear, it wasn't a separate RIF, it was all one RIF with the multiple building types, but they were hyperlinked, so you didn't have to scroll through the whole document just to find one building.
I see. So you could jump to domestic
Yes.
dwellings out of the RIF?
Yes.
So when you say created a separate RIF, you mean a separate link from
Yes.
the RIF? Is that what you mean?
Yes, I do.
I follow. Now, if you go on to paragraph 28 below what I've just read to you, you say that in the middle of the paragraph, the FSG RIFs that were tailored to specific building types went live in February 2011. And indeed, we have a record from the Lakenal House Board meeting on the 4th of February 2011, which I think you attended. We don't need to go to it, which says, records you saying that it was ready to go live the following week. Does that accord with your recollection?
It does, yes.
And if we go to your Exhibit 6, which you refer to in this paragraph, LFB 00121237, I'll just put it up for you briefly now, because we'll come back to it in detail a bit later on. But here is an email from you to all control staff about the RIFs of the 23rd of February 2011, entitled Communications Measures for Staff, Fire Survival Guidance, and the second paragraph down, Fire Survival Guidance RIF. Is that about the date when the new FSG RIF for CROs went live?
Yes, that's the one that I would have signed off on.
Once the policy went live, did you consider arranging a workshop or test exercise to test out whether the RIFs worked in practice?
No, we didn't, but I believe there was some subsequent feedback from our operations managers. So at one point, I probably would have shared this at the Brigade Control Management meeting, and we would have had some feedback from that.
Right. Why didn't you arrange a workshop or test exercise to test it out, to see whether it worked in practice?
So I think we were quite clear from the gap analysis that we wanted to add some proactive questions in there. We also wanted to make sure it covered a range of building types, and that was a decision that the four of us had come up with as well, who had been working on that.
And the feedback you're referring to, was that informal back to you by the OMs or AOMs?
It would have been at the Brigade Control Management meeting, so they either would have said at the time or they would have emailed me directly.
Were the revised RIFs tested at the Haygate Challenge exercise on the 16th of June 2011, 5 months after the new RIFs went live?
I don't recall.
Can you think of a reason why they wouldn't have been?
No, just that it was an exercise, so there might have been people busy just monitoring or putting in injects, and the training team wouldn't have been able to observe if people were using the RIF.
Was the Haygate Challenge not a very good opportunity to stress test the revisions that had been made to Policy 539, twice in fact, September 2010 and February 2011, and the newly revised RIFs, to make sure they really worked?
I think the stress test was that the training that we had delivered had worked.
Can we then go to LFB 302831? I'm so sorry. LFB 3028381. This is an email sent to you, second email down on the page, from Graham Bonnet on the 27th of June 2011. And you and Lindsay Turner, Chris Sharp and Nikki O'Shea are the recipients of that email. The subject is fire survival guidance. And Graham Bonnet starts by offering some observations about the structure and content of the FSG presentation in an email below that. And then he goes on to say, he says that, I believe that some of the presentation content is inconsistent with the revised FSG operator RIF that was introduced following the management review earlier this year. Although FSG is based on the Home Office Circular of 1993, as you know, the LFB made several changes to the guidance, which was incorporated into the RIF. And if we go to the top email on the same day, this is quite early in the morning, you forward this on to Scott Hayward. You see that?
Yes.
And you say, "Go Graham!" ! Think his comments sum up the quality of this quotes late unquote training package. What do you think? And now if you go down to page 3 of this email run, we'll see what it is that he says specifically. There's quite a lot in this email, but I just want to pick out the bits that I want to ask you about specifically. And if you look about a third of the way down your screen, it says, forgive me. The presentation covers detail about advising caller to phone back. This is not included in RIF, although I agree it should be. Plus, consideration needs to be given as to whether or not to provide advice in RIF on concluding conversation with caller if they're clearly not in danger. And then, if you go lower down, you then see conclusions / recommendations. I believe it's vital to ensure absolute clarity and consistency in all documentation relating to FSG, as the RIF has been specifically designed to guide and assist staff whilst actually handling an FSG call. I feel it is the RIF upon which most focus should be placed when undertaking refresher training, rather than a separate FSG presentation that differs in both structure and content in critical areas as mentioned above. Now, I've only read one of those to you, but there are others, of course. And then if we turn right to the very bottom of the page, the last two words in the paragraph, I also, and if we turn to page 4, he says, I also suggest that FSG exercises are held to test the suitability of the RIF's operator and supervisor when dealing with FSG calls and to ascertain whether changes / improvements are necessary. I would be happy to assist in this process. Did you or did Scott Hayward respond to Graham Bonnet on any of his criticisms or suggestions?
I can't remember specifically, but it would have been discussed, and I'm sure Lindsay and the training team would have then taken that feedback, and I believe the training in 2011 did change.
Well, after June 2011?
I'm not sure. I know I reviewed the training package in 2011. Graham has obviously commented on its need to review, and I would imagine that he's made the same as observation as us, that we had amended the RIFs to reflect what we had learnt from Lacanau, about what support the operators needed, and therefore that should be aligned with the training.
Right. So the RIFs have been revised in and rolled out in February 2011. Graham Bonnet makes these further suggestions in June 2011.
Yeah.
Can you remember re-revising the RIFs to take into account some or all of his suggestions?
No, I think his suggestions are the same as ours, that the RIFs had been re-revised based on our learning from Lacanau, and therefore the training should be revised to align with the RIF.
So you recall amendments to the training package?
I would imagine there were some. I know that happened in 2011.
Okay. Now, just going back to the very top of the email string, we saw it earlier. You said, "Go Graham!" ! Was that comment to reflect your agreement with Graham Bonnet and to congratulate his bluntness, or your disagreement with him and an intention to defend the new FSG package, but also the training that went with it?
No, my agreement.
Your agreement. Okay. Now, can we then look at paragraph 27 of your statement, please, at page 12? You say there, in the last sentence, I understand that Vic Bagnall subsequently removed the references to multiple building types in the FSG RIF during my secondment to CFOA. Of course, so that's sometime between the 1st of September 2012 and early January 2015.
Yes.
Can you confirm that it was the version amended by Vic Bagnall in 2013 and then later in 2014? Those are dates we get from different documents. You weren't there at the time, but that the version amended by him, at least, was the one in force at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire?
I can't know. I couldn't be sure.
When you returned from your secondment to CFOA in January 2015, did you review the revised FSG RIFs?
No, but I was told that they had been changed, and that was based on feedback from operations managers, probably from some CROs as well.
Right.
But and I was told that they had been amended.
Why weren't you keen to review the revised FSG RIFs, given that you had been told that they'd been changed?
Just because, as we've covered, like anybody else in London Fire Brigade, an officer that would come in and take over a role from someone else, it wasn't practice to review their work, and they'd had some feedback from operations managers and from CROs about some changes, I believe, and this is only from what I was told, and they wanted to see it differently, and that had been facilitated.
But given your involvement in 2011 in the amendments and the rollout and the training packages and the revisions to those, were you not interested to know what, if anything, had changed in your absence?
I think I would have looked at the RIF. I certainly wouldn't have not looked at it, but not in terms of reviewing it, because I wasn't the only one in that department that had been involved in the Lacanau review.
No, but you were coming back and essentially taking over the running of OST, which you hadn't had, I think, when you left to the CFOA.
No, I hadn't done that.
And at that point, given your overall control, I'd just like to know why you didn't think it necessary just to check with yourself, really, to make sure you'd understood what had changed in your absence.
No, I think I was comfortable that the feedback that had been received had been acted on, and there was a RIF in place.
Did you check at that stage, in and from January 2015, whether the revised RIF still complied with national guidance, if it ever did?
No, not personally.
Why is that?
Because I would have made the assumption that it would align with national guidance.
Can we go to the RIF that you created, so that we can be familiar with it? LFB 00121240 It's your JS9, Ms. Smith. I think you've exhibited this. Is this the document into which you had your input in 2010 and rolled out in February 2011, do you think?
Yes.
With its later amendments, admittedly. Yes?
Yes.
And if you go to the foot of the screen, you can see under the question, what type of property are you in? 1.1 house, 1.2 HMO, flat conversion, bed sit, 1.3 purpose-built flat, caller is inside flat on fire. Now they're in red. Does that tell us that there's a hyperlink?
Yes.
I see. And then that would take the reader to the correct part of the RIF for that type of building?
Yes, that's correct.
So was it the intention that if a CRO was talking to someone from a high-rise building who needed fire survival guidance and the fire was not inside the caller's flat, they would open up the RIF and click on 1.4?
Yes.
And 1.4 we can see at the top of page 2. 1.4, purpose-built flats, fire not inside caller's flat, fires elsewhere in premises. And that would take them to a different section of this document, would it?
Yes.
And if we go to page 14, I think we see where, is this right? The CRO ends up. Rather than scrolling down, you get dropped down to lower down in it. And if you go to the bottom of the screen, you can see there's section 1.4, purpose-built flat, yes?
Yes.
So that's where the CRO goes, is it?
Yes.
And that then sets out the steps the CRO should take when speaking to a caller, yes?
Yes.
How did you go about revising the RIF, specifically in this respect, according to national guidance? Did you consult Fire Service Circular 1093?
In terms of purpose-built flats where the fire is not inside the caller's flat?
Yes.
Not so much 1093. I don't believe that covers purpose-built flats or has one relative minor mention to it. I think we used the current government guidance that was extant at the time of this review, just after Lacanau. There was definitely a focus from the Lacanau board and direction to us to be clear on stay put guidance, and so we used that.
Can you identify that? You say we used the current government guidance extant at the time of this review, just after Lacanau. What was that?
That if you were in a purpose-built flat and you were not being affected by fire, heat or smoke, you were to stay put.
What was the name of the government guidance?
Or I don't know, but I think it is referenced in the Control Lacanau report.
Right. Is that the LGA document, the Local Government Association document? I'm guessing.
I thought it was from DCLG, but I couldn't be sure.
Right.
But it is referenced in there.
But you can't tell us.
No, apologies.
You can't tell us specifically. No. Right. Well, we may come back to that.
Okay.
Did you consider Fire Service Circular 5404 when carrying out these revisions?
No.
And is that because, as a result of the gap analysis completed in April 2010, you decided not to?
Yes, like I said, that hadn't been adopted by LFB.
Can we go to Group Manager Lindridge's review in January 2013, which we went to on Thursday? That's at LFB 3033943. And if we go to page 12 in that, please, at the top of the page, Group Manager Lindridge has a summary, and this is in the summary conclusions part of his report. And this is under Action Reference 9, Entry on Action Log, FSG, Revise RIF, Reference Information File. Expected outcome, the RIF files for FSG should comply with national guidance. And then he goes on to say, review process findings. The RIF provides the control room operators, CROs, with an aid memoir for handling FSG calls based on national guidance, and he refers to the Circular 1093. Now, just bearing in mind the date of this document is January 2013. So you are already at the CFOA by then, and your revision work on RIFs is done.
Yes.
Right. And note the reference there to the national guidance. And then he goes on Two versions exist, one for the CRO and one for the control supervisor, assistant operations manager. FSC 5404 has not been adopted, which introduces three-stage approach to emergency call handling and the assessment of the caller. You see that? We discussed that earlier.
Yes.
The format of operator's RIF is not favoured by the CROs, and a single-page flowchart was requested from the Ops support team in March 2012. No evidence of this flowchart existence or development has been provided. So, just breaking that up a bit first, do you agree, I think you do, that FSC 5404 was not adopted into the RIF? He's right about that.
Yes.
And I think that, again, you said, is consistently with what you told us earlier, that was a deliberate decision, was it?
I'm not, like I say, we couldn't find any documentation to say if a decision had been made or not about adopting 5404 previously, but it wasn't in adoption in the control room when I joined in 2007.
Right. That was consistent, at least, with the decision not to include FSC 5404 as part of the gap analysis.
Yes.
Yes. Now, he then goes on to say that the format was not favoured by the CROs, and a single-page flowchart was requested from the Ops support team in March 2012. Now, that was long before, well, some months before at least, you left for the CFOA. Do you remember that?
No.
Do you know what he's talking about?
No.
Do you remember any feedback coming from operators that they didn't like the RIF?
Not specifically during that time, but that aligns with when I returned, I'd heard and why the changes had been made to the RIF.
So you have no recollection of anybody in the operational support team requesting a single-page flowchart in March 2012 or even thereabouts?
I don't, but I requesting a flowchart is probably something that had come from one of the watch or CRO that would have found that useful, and they might have just gone about doing that themselves.
Now let's go to the RIF for operators that you created, and the section that we looked at earlier for callers from a purpose-built flat where the fire is elsewhere in the block. We need to go back to the RIF. That's at LFB 00121240, page 14. Purpose-built flat, section 1.4. Now let's just look at the prompts. Ask caller, are you or is your flat being affected by heat or smoke? If not affected, tell caller. You see the two bullet points. And then if we turn the page, or rather the bottom of the page, it says assess, it says escape, bottom of page 14, escape if caller needs to get out but can't ask. Then top of page 15, you see it says what's stopping you from getting out? Is there another safe way to get out?
Yes.
Example questions, guidance, and you can see the questions set out there about the building. And then if there's a lot of smoke, example guidance, get as low as possible where there is less smoke and the air is cleaner. If the caller is still unable to get out, example guidance, try to stay calm. I'm going to give you some advice. And then obtain caller's name, write it down and use it, consider telling them your name, and then assess situation before giving advice, example questions, do you know where the fire is, where are you in relation to the fire, etc. And then page 16, further similar questions, are you at the front or back of the building, is anyone with you, etc., etc. And you can read down that, and then record essential information obtained from caller on ProCAD. Ensure supervisor IC are notified of the details and are kept updated throughout the call if circumstances change. Depending on caller's response, ask reactive questions as necessary and provide appropriate guidance to protect the caller as detailed below. And then protect caller, and you could see all those questions there about windows, about doors, about what happens if the door becomes too hot. Then if we turn to page 17, top of the page, cover nose and mouth with cloth, and then assist with rescue, hang sheets, make noise, reassure caller, example, guidance, the firefighters are on their way, the firefighters know where you are, etc. Reassess regularly, that's 17, and then over the page to 18, use positive statements during the call, ask the caller to tell you something about themselves, but remember to assess the situation, and then imminent danger, and then lower down the screen, window escape guidance, and then page 19, last resort, how to break a window, and that's it. Now, I've taken you through that slowly, I hope, slowly enough. Would you agree with the review we've just performed that those stages in the RIF do not include the stage assess the caller that we saw in FSC 5404?
No, not in detail. It
Well, not at all.
just comes from asking the caller what's stopping you from leaving.
Yes, but that's
Yes.
not a request for age, ethnicity, gender, or any kind of vulnerability, is it?
No,
I mean, there's simply no reflection, would you accept, of the assessment of the caller as opposed to the situation reflected anywhere in this RIF for control room operators.
no,
Do you agree that that meant that control room operators were not specifically directed to take information from the caller about themselves and their abilities that might impede their escape?
I would suggest that that was covered in their training about the engagement with the caller and asking questions about the caller. As you say, these are just prompt, proactive questions that operators would look at if they needed any additional support. So not a guidance document and not a policy document to follow, but just some supportive questions should you need. Like the email that you've referred to, or the report written by Dave Lindridge, you know, they've obviously asked for an additional aid memoir to support them on that. So it is the basic guidance documents for them to follow, and not the detail that they would have received in training.
What was the point of training them on the national guidance in 5404 about assessing the caller, but not having a set of simple questions in the RIF in addition to the questions you've got? What was the problem with that?
But there wasn't any problem. Like I say, I just think that they were just proactive questions that we could ask the caller. We had discussed, and the board, supported by legal, had come up with some phrases to use and wording that we could use, and we were focused about making sure that that was there for a control officer should they need it.
Why was it thought appropriate to leave the assessment of the caller element of fire survival guidance only to training, whenever and however that was delivered, and not have it either in the policy or in the RIF, the detailed RIF with the actual prompts that the actual CRO goes on during an actual call?
Like I think I said, I think that's just in our normal day-to-day call handling. That's the engagement and the assessment of the caller happens naturally. So maybe we didn't specifically focus on that.
Well, given that it's in the national guidance, I would suggest to you that this was actually a positive decision taken by the Brigade not to do what national guidance required, namely assess not only the situation but the caller themselves.
Well, certainly not on my part. I don't believe we were really clear, and I think some of the evidence and the comments I've made on training, that we were really clear about how we wanted to focus back to national guidance 1093 in terms of fire survival guidance.
Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment? I'm afraid I'm still in the middle of this topic, and I could probably finish it in 5 minutes.
Do you mean 5 minutes?
No, probably not.
In that case, I think we'd be wiser to take our break now, didn't you?
Yes.
Yes, all right. Well, I think we will have our break now, Ms. Smith, so we'll stop now. We'll come back at 25 to 12, please. And again, while you're out of the room, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Please go. Yes, if you'd like to go to the usher, then thank you. Thank you, Mr. Millett. 25 to 12, please. Okay. Would you ask Ms Smith to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Billett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Smith, before we broke, we were looking at the control room operator RIF and the omission of anything in there about assessing the caller. If we go to your witness statement, please, at page 16, paragraph 40. In the third line there, you say, a previous version of the RIF from 2007 contemplates disability issues under the PROTECT principle, Exhibit JS 13. If we go to that version that you exhibit, that's at LFB 00121224. And am I right in thinking that's the one you amended? You may not be able to tell from the first page, but it doesn't have the hyperlinks in it on a building-by-building basis, so that may help you.
Yes.
Yes. If we go to page 2, you can see page 2. Yes, thank you. You can see in capitals next to the bullet points, suggest an alternative escape route, and as a last resort of escape, only if the caller suggests it, and then if the caller cannot escape, offer reassurance, be positive, and we've got a list of those things there. And if we scroll down the screen to lower down page 2, we can see the last asterisk. Protect the caller if they can't escape. First bullet point, does the caller have any disability? Is their mobility impaired that may affect them carrying out any of these actions? Now, we don't see that in the amended version of the RIF. Why was that element specifically removed from the Protect the Caller stage in the revised RIF?
I'm not sure it was specifically removed. I agree it is not in the new RIF. I'm not sure, I can't recall if there was an agreement that it would be in the training and that actually the RIF should just focus on those proactive questions I spoke about before.
Well, you say you can't recall if there was an agreement that it would be in the training. Do you remember, to the best of your recollection, was there a discussion about what should happen to that element of protection of the caller when you came to revise the RIF in 2010 to 2011?
No, I can't recall any specific discussion either way of it being added or removed from it.
Are you able to explain why that element was removed from the revised RIF?
Well, only as what I said to you before in the top window when it says, is there anything stopping you from getting out, and that it would have then been reinforced to CROs in the training.
If we go back to page 16 of your statement, please, and look at paragraph 40. Again, you say in the next sentence, in a later version of the RIF in 2013, the capability of the caller is considered under the Control Information Form heading, which sets out information a CRO should be looking to take down during an FSG call. Now, I want to examine that with you, please. If we go to the later version of the RIF that was in force on the night of the Grenfell Tower fire itself, we find that at LFB 00122837. That's the first page. If we go to page 6, please, and look at the very, well, that is the whole of page 6, I think, for present purposes. You've got paragraph 2.3, Control Information Form, and it says, the Control Information Form is completed at the incident from information provided by Brigade Control to include the following where available. And then if you scroll your eyes down, the list of things, you can see any additional information, if provided or requested from incident. Other information may include age, gender, and capability of those involved. Is that what you're referring to in your statement?
Yes.
would you agree that that's the only place in the RIF that mentions age, gender and capability?
Well, I haven't seen it for a while, but yes,
Right.
I'll take it from you that it is.
Yeah. And looking at it, it would appear, do you agree that the CRO would need to wait for the caller to provide that information or the incident ground to ask for it?
So the details that are contained on the control information form look exactly like a lift from the firefighter's control information form, but we have added in about any additional information, and that probably aligns with what I was trying to explain in terms of call taking in general terms and call handling and the additional information that we tend to gather on calls. But yes, we have been specific with age, gender and capability.
And as it says, the control information form is not completed in the control room, it's completed at the incident.
It is, yes.
And therefore, the additional information would be information given by the control room to the incident ground itself, wouldn't it?
Yes.
And therefore would only be as good as the information obtained by the control room operator.
Yes.
Yes. There's nothing in here, I think you would accept, as there had been in the 2007 version of the RIF, which expressly indicates that the CRO would actually positively ask for that information when protecting the caller. Can you tell us why it was dropped from the RIF, indeed dropped from the policy and dropped from the RIF, and moved only to a rather oblique reference in the control information form at the fireground?
No, all I can say is that it must have been in the training and the FSG training that we were rolling out to control staff.
Before the Grenfell Tower fire, were you aware that both the policy 539, and the CRO RIFs contained no specific direction that the CRO should be the person to undertake an assessment of the caller, as specified in 5504 National Guidance?
In terms of age, gender and capability, do you mean?
If you like, as a summary of the four elements under assess the caller, yes.
No, not that I can recall, but I would have, as I've explained, I would have thought the general assessment to begin with and how control officers undertake that would have included that in there.
Right. Now I'm going to go on to a different topic, which is the meaning of affected by fire, smoke or heat in the guidance itself. Before I do, I just want to examine something with you. You said this morning. You told us this morning, and for those following in the raw transcript, it's at page 12, lines 18 through to 24, that you weren't involved in the revision or amendment done to policy 539 in September 2010.
I believe from looking at the two versions you've shown me, I don't believe I was involved in the 2010 one. The 2011, yes, I was.
Yes. I just want to show you one or two emails from the time to see if your recollection is as you've told us. Can we start at LFB 000057934, please? And as always with these things, we start at the foot of page 3. Well, they're not always page 3, but the foot of the email run, please. And this is an email sent by, take it from me, it's at the bottom of page 2, Amelia Reynolds to Lindsay Turner, copy to you and Scott Hayward, subject policy 539 draft amendments. And you can see it's signed off by Amelia Reynolds, who's team leader in BCT. Can you just tell us what her role was, what her function was?
So she was part of, a team leader would have been a assistance operations manager in the training team.
In the training team.
Yeah.
Did you have any involvement in the mechanics of the drafting or creation of the revisions of policy 539?
It looks like it because she sent them to Lindsay.
Yes.
With the amendments.
And if we scroll up, please, to the next email, page 2, foot of page 2, we can see an email from Scott Hayward to Lindsay Turner, copy to you, 20th July 2010. Attached is the feedback for the reviewed ECM policy document, and there's a lot. We've spent a good 4 hours reviewing this document when the purpose of Amelia being detached from training was to concentrate on updating and improving this. ECM is emergency call management, isn't it?
Yes.
This is talking about policy 539, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And then next paragraph, we've commented and added my own spin on the main part of the document and have some additional notes for the appendices which are detailed below. And then he sets out some comments there, Appendix 1, 2 and 3. You can see what he's picked up there. I don't need to go to the detail for this purpose. And then we suggest a reread of the entire document, working against the comments made and ensure what is being stated is in a RIF or delivered to staff, etc. Appendix 3 there, just looking at the list of things I should have asked you, is fire survival guidance, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. Who's the we he's referring to in this email?
I don't know. It could be Scott and I and Tim Cutbill and Tom Davies.
Now, you received this at the time. My question is, did the we include you as part of the reviewing team?
Yes, because there were the 4 of us working on the control investigation for Lacanau, so I would presume so.
And then if you go to the foot of page 1, email from Lindsay Turner to Scott Hayward by way of response, copy to you, same day, 20th July 2010. Hi Scott, in Amelia's defence, she started the work. I would not want her making changes to this policy that were outside of her level of authority. I agree we need to sit down and go through this and thought we were going to do this either today or yesterday. Rather than go through the bullet points below, and because it is obvious you feel this policy needs a lot of work, can I suggest that either Joanne or yourself meet with Amelia to advise her of the way forward? Or maybe we should, the 3 of us, get together and agree what we want in, developed or out before we give it to Amelia. Personally, I realise there needs to be some changes, but I'm not sure where the direction has come from for such change. I don't think we need the last paragraph. Now, you were copied into that. Did you have a meeting with her or get involved in the 3-way discussion of the amendments to Policy 539?
I can't recall, but I would imagine that there was a meeting and we would have discussed it between the 3 of us. That's what we usually did.
And we can see from the top of page 1 there's a response to Lindsay Turner from Scott Hayward, not in fact a copy to you, which I don't think I need to show you. But that's
perhaps I wasn't then involved in it. Perhaps it was between Scott and Lindsay.
But possibly. But do you remember? Does this prompt a recollection that in fact you were more involved than you told us this morning?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that leads. Whilst we would have had some discussion and I would have had some input, possibly with as a group, because we were investigating the Lacanau incident. I don't recall ever amending or updating or suggesting amendments to policy 539 at that time.
There was a good rationale there, wasn't there, for involving you, given your position at the time and given the scale of the amendments needed to policy 539?
Well, Scott was also party to that group, and he may have then shared that with Tim Cutbill and Tom Davies as well. Maybe I was out at another meeting or on another project at the time. So.
But you were closer to the... I'm sorry, you were going to say something?
No, sorry.
You were closer to the day-to-day operations of the control room than Scott Hayward was, weren't you, at the time?
I think in terms of what we were doing with the Lacanau, and you've seen Scott's commented as well, we had the same understanding. We'd worked on the gap analysis and understood what needed to be changed. Right. I don't think he was any particular... I was closer than that. I understood the concept of fire survival guidance and what it meant to take a fire survival guidance call, and then with my knowledge of the system, perhaps added something to it, but not in terms of drafting policy.
Right. Did you know, well, did you look at the attachment to this email at the time? Draft amendments?
Possibly.
Did you know that the there was an amendment to the disability paragraph which existed in the 2007 version that we've seen, which was removed.
Not that I particularly noted, but again, that might have been discussed if Scott and Lindsay met.
Right. I mean, looking at the email run I've shown you and casting your mind back, how sure are you that you were not involved in the amendments to Policy 539?
Having read the document that you showed and displayed, I'm pretty confident that the original amendments I was not involved in, but did have some input into the updated version in 2011.
Can we then look at LFB 00109145? Now, if we start at page 4 in the customary way and then scroll up, this is an email from Gemma, who is Gemma Ling, to Amelia Reynolds, 2nd of September 2010. So we moved to later in the year. Hi, Amelia, I found the original email. If you have any questions, let me know. And then if you go up to page 3, Amelia Reynolds responds. And we need the bottom of page 2 for that, please. It's an email from Amelia Reynolds, same date, to you, copy to Lindsay Turner, Scott Hayward, and others, forwarding 539 completed. Hi, Joanne. This is the most up-to-date version of the Emergency Call Management Policy 539. It is still awaiting to be published, as Scott is trying to make amendments to the suicide information we use and is in consultation with advisory and counselling. With regard to the FSG information, the appendix on the policy relates to information I updated from 1093 and our training documentation. It does not give the definition below. The LFB consider an FSG call as being a call to the Brigade control where the caller believes that they are unable to leave their premises due to the effects of fire, and where the CA remains on the line providing appropriate advice until either the caller is able to leave by their own means, is rescued by the fire brigade, or the line is cleared. If you want me to add this statement to the appendix, it can easily be put in before it is published. You see that? And then your response, if you go back to page 2, from you, same day, back to Amelia Reynolds. Hi, Amelia. Yes, please. Could we include it? Many thanks, Joanne. Yes?
Yes.
And then page 1, not much on that page, essentially second email, back to you from Amelia Reynolds, same day. Joanne, all done. Regards, Amelia Reynolds. Your response to her the following day, 3rd of September 2010, the day of publication. Many thanks, Amelia. Regards, Joanne. Looking at that, do you accept that you were involved, at least in part, in making the actual amendments to Policy 539, as amended in September 2010?
I think Amelia, as it's clear from the email, Amelia has asked me if we would like a definition in. Amelia's account about her updating it is quite clear in the email, and she's clearly asked me if we think the new definition of FSG was to be added, and I've confirmed that.
Why would it be you, she asked, given, as you told us, you weren't the one involved in any of the other discussions about the amendments earlier in the year?
Perhaps I was the only one in on that day, perhaps because she wanted to get it published, perhaps because we'd had a prior conversation. It's not unusual for all three of us to be asked. Maybe if I hadn't been in and Lindsay had been, or I hadn't been in and Scott had been, she would have asked one of them.
Now, can we then go to the question I wanted to come to, which, and we may come back to that in due course, but can I go to the question of the meaning of affected by fire, smoke or heat? Can we go back to the RIF, please? LFB 00121240. This is the one you created in 2010 to 11 at your JS9. And on page 14, it says, ask caller, just under 1.4 purpose-built flat, fire not inside caller's flat, fire is elsewhere in block, ask caller, are you or is your flat being affected by heat or smoke? You see that?
Yes.
Yes. Now, can we look at, with that in mind, at paragraph 36 of your statement, please, on page 15. We saw this paragraph before. I think I read this part to you, in fact. And you say, I asked John Bradbury and Jim Knighton what information it would be helpful to obtain from a caller during an FSG call, this including the determination of whether a caller is, quotes, affected, close quotes, by fire, heat or smoke. Did Jim Bradbury or Jim Knighton, John Bradbury or Jim Knighton assist you with how a CRO should determine if somebody was affected, open quotes, close quotes, by fire, heat or smoke?
I don't believe so.
Did you consider putting any further explanation into the RIF about how a CRO should determine if a caller was, quotes, affected, unquotes, by fire, heat or smoke?
No, but I think that conversation might have developed into with OST and training, and they might have asked fire safety when they were talking to them. Some detail.
What did you mean by affected?
What do I mean by affected?
Well, let me try it differently. You can see the words in the RIF. Are you or is your flat being affected by heat or smoke? Did you draft those words?
Yes, I would have spoken to Graham, and together we would have formulated the wording. But yes, they would have effectively come from me. Right.
What did you intend by the word affected?
Well, I think that was from policy 1093 that we had been asked to go back to the principles, which says, is a caller affected by fire, heat or smoke?
What did you understand by the word affected?
I would say my understanding is that if they are having if smoke is directly affecting them in terms of affecting their breathing or their premise, i.e. entering their premise, would be affected.
So not if there was smoke and fire all around them, but not either in their compartment or in affecting them physically?
Well, I think that's probably led from the presentation and the training that was delivered about compartmentation to all control officers. That's certainly been something that I've had training in throughout my career about compartmentation.
Did you consider putting any further explanation into the RIF about how a CRO should go about determining whether a caller was affected in the way you intended or understood?
No, and I can't be sure that was discussed in training, but I would imagine that should have been captured in training.
So, not the RIF, but training?
Yes.
Right. And again, why not insert into the RIF one or two prompts or sub-prompts to help the CRO make that determination?
Yes, I think maybe just at the time that we didn't foresee that
right.
We were able to support a caller if they were being affected, i.e. smoke was entering their property or was affecting them.
Can I then turn to assessment of safety routes of escape, if they are affected in the way you explained? Now, you'll remember, maybe you won't, there's nothing wrong with that, but one of the findings of the chairman in the Phase 1 report was that the RIF operators did not contain clear guidance about how to go about assessing the safety of routes of escape if the caller is or says that they are affected by heat, smoke or fire or feel unsafe. And just for the record, that's paragraph 29.49C of our Phase 1 report. As I say, I don't expect that you would necessarily remember that, but that is there. And what comes from it is a question: did you ever yourself consider whether further guidance was needed within the RIF to help CROs assess the safety routes of escape when a caller told them that they were affected by heat, smoke or fire, or felt unsafe?
Well, I must have at one point, because when I drafted the RIF, we did have some bullet points and some indications about seeking alternative escape routes.
Yes. And we'll look at those. But before we do that, let's go to Vic Bagnall's statement. He exhibits to his statement to the inquiry a document at LFB 00122833. And I'll just show you I'll show you this document. He says that this is feedback. I'll keep that on the screen, but can I also show you how he describes this document? And I'm doing that because this is from April 2014, at a time when you were at CFOA. Can we have his statement on the screen, please, at LFB 00122821? And can we go in it, please, to page 5, paragraph 15? He says there, it's quite a long sentence, but it's just 6 lines up from the bottom. There were further slight amendments made in the versions published in April 2014. These are the updated FSG RIFs that he updated in April 2014. Firstly, to standardise the incident type codes staff would be required to use when handling FSG calls, and secondly, to include additional question prompts for call handlers following feedback received from command unit staff during training workshops, including asking whether the caller or anyone had a disability. Exhibit VB2. And Exhibit VB2 is what we see on the left-hand side. Now, looking at the document on the left-hand side, is it something you think you've ever seen before?
No, I haven't.
You haven't?
No.
Well, let's take it as quickly as we can then. Can we look at 8 paragraphs down? It says, finding out how far from the nearest stairwell the caller's flat is. This would assist crews when planning en route possible hose lengths. It will also assist control in deciding if the caller could possibly make it to the stairwell. This will also make the caller think about the layout, and they may realise that actually they can get out. Now, take it from me that the version of the RIF from April 2014 did not include that question as a specific prompt. Now, you weren't there at the time, so I'm going to assume that you aren't able to answer the specific question as to why it didn't. Is that right?
No, I wasn't there at the time. No, I can't answer.
No,
that.
but when you came back,
Yeah.
did you notice that specific question wasn't in there as a specific prompt?
No, and I don't believe I'd seen the feedback from the command unit that you've just displayed there, and neither was I aware of GM Lindridge's report for the Lakanal House Board either, and I wasn't made aware that had been written and was in existence.
Right. The Lindridge report is January 2013, and of course you'd been at the CFOA about 5 months by then, and were to remain there for a further 2 years. But are you telling us that even when you came back in January 2015, nobody showed you the Lindridge review?
No.
When was the first time you saw the Lindridge review?
Whilst preparing for phase 2.
Right. Going back to this point, though, did you ever yourself consider including this type of question or any other questions being put into the RIF to help CROs assess the safety routes of escape for callers?
No, I don't recall that. If it helps the inquiry, I would maybe just to consider that there has always been discussions about control staff having ORD access and being able to view information. So maybe that point was taken up and trying to get control staff access so they could see the layout of the flats and how many stairwells it had and the nearest stairwell. But
You said there's always been discussion about that.
there has been discussion for a while, certainly, yeah.
For a while, when? Before the Grenfell Tower fire?
Yes, possibly, yes.
Right. What happened to those discussions?
I don't know. I think we were made aware that we could access it when we were having difficulties with vision and used another programme from LFB to access some address information, which also contained information on operational risk database.
Was that ever something that you recall institutionalising in the control room? In other words, making it a norm that CROs would go onto the ORD as soon as the call came in, so that they would have in front of them the layout of the building?
It was on a different system to the mobilising system, so that would have been quite difficult to achieve. And it's called eye mapping, I believe. That icon isn't very easy to navigate when you're in there, but we were aware of it and staff were aware of it because, like I say, when we were having difficulties with the vision mobilising system, we'd used eye mapping one or two times or maybe more to search for addresses.
Right. And that would have been what, in late 2015, early 2016?
Early 2016, yes.
Yes.
After we'd gone live, but we were still having technical difficulties with it.
And was the reason you needed to go to eye mapping because you couldn't get the addresses?
Yes, because
Right.
we'd lost our
Rather than
mobilising
a specific
system.
need to understand precisely the layout of the building?
Yes, it was then we realised that eye mapping would give us access to that.
Now, I'd like to ask you some questions next about a different topic, which is assurances, false assurances given to callers. You've explained that you used the gap analysis to create the RIFs, and we've already seen in the gap analysis that you identified the fact that, and I'll just quote this back to you because we've seen it already, the LFB training package tends to encourage a strong attachment between caller and fire control operator and reiterates the use of reassuring phrases which may be construed as offering a false sense of security. That was a point, you remember, we saw that?
Yes.
Picked up in the gap analysis. And you remember we also saw that was at odds with the national guidance contained in FSC 1093. Yes?
Yes.
Because that's a gap. And we've had that already. Just for our purposes, for reference, that's page 11 at LFB 404750 within the gap analysis itself. Now, against that background, would you agree that in the FSG RIFs that you created, and as later amended by Vic Bagnall in April 2014, there was no guidance to CROs that they should not offer a false sense of security when providing reassurance to a caller?
No, it isn't explicit in the RIFs. But again, like in policy and like most policies in London Fire Brigade and the route that we've followed, it doesn't tend to have what you shouldn't do in it. It tends to be a guidance note on what you should do rather than what you shouldn't. So I'm not sure if that would have occurred to the group, including me, that were updating it, to be specific not to add it in. But certainly it is a discussion in the training. It was discussed in the training. Right.
So is this again another instance of not in the policy, not in the RIFs, but in the training?
Yes.
Right. Then let's look at the gap analysis at LFB. Let's look at the circular, FSC 1093, LFB 403617. We saw this on Thursday, paragraph 2, last sentence. Additionally, in circumstances such as these, which is where the caller is prevented from escaping due to locations such as high-rise flats, that's one of them, a fire control operator may need to take into account that the normal procedure of calming the caller may not be appropriate and may even be dangerous in some circumstances. Now, given that you say that the gap analysis was used to create FSG RIFs, why didn't you include these warnings in the RIFs for control room operators at least to be aware of?
I believe we were all comfortable that we'd done the revisions and that we'd changed substantially and we'd removed a vast amount of bullet points and questioning and discussion and learning, which relied and which focused on bonding with the caller and forming a relationship with the caller. And I think we felt that we had moved to a position where the information we were given, and this had been agreed by legal through the Lakanal House Board, or at least the Lakanal House team, that the statements that we provided to control staff to give to callers were factual, but didn't lull callers into a false sense of security, and that we didn't encourage bonding. And I think we tried to do that through training and some of the role play that was in the training.
Yes, and we'll come to that in due course. But I think the answer to my question is not in the RIFs, but in the training.
Yes.
Now, when you came back from your secondment in January 2015, did you, I think the answer is no, because of what you told us before, but just confirm for us, please. You didn't do an exercise whereby you reviewed the RIFs revised by Vic Bagnall in April 2014 and compare those with national guidance?
No, I didn't. I was solely focused on the new mobilising system and the requirements.
And the assumption, I think you told us earlier, you'd made that he wouldn't have made amendments unless they'd been in line with national guidance. I think that's what you told us earlier.
I think, yeah, and certainly seeing the information provided in GM Lindage's report, they'd obviously made some changes on that report and recommendations. So,
well, you say certainly seeing the information provided in GM Lindage's report.
Yeah.
That's the report that you told us you didn't see until you were preparing for phase 2.
No, seeing after that, I can understand that they made those changes. Right. Based on some of the feedback in that report and some reviews that they may have undertaken.
So you're not telling us that you didn't undertake a review of Vic Bagnall's amendments against the national guidance because of something you'd seen in the Lindridge report at the time?
No, I was just affirming that I can understand now, after seeing Dave Lindage's report, why they had made some changes.
Yes. Now, can we go back to your witness statement, please? Paragraph 39, page 16. You say there, I recall that one of the updates to the RIF was that we removed comments in the RIF about bonding with the caller, as it was acknowledged that this should not be included in giving FSG advice. Following the review of Policy 539, the updated operator RIF, which you exhibit as JS9, contains more limited guidance on how to appropriately reassure the caller whilst making only true statements such as the firefighters are on their way. Just looking at that, I'm focusing first on the first sentence, if I can. I'll come to the second one shortly. Can you please be shown LFB 3033220? This is about bonding. And here is an email at the top of the page that you sent to Graham Bonnet, Peter Suarez, copy to Scott Hayward, 3rd of January 2011. So this is at the time you're amending the RIFs, I think, isn't it?
Yes, it looks like it, yeah.
Because they were rolled out on the 23rd of February 2011, as we saw earlier this morning. Hi, Graham and Peter. Please find attached the latest version of the FSG RIF. I've clarified the questions relating to closing vents and deleted the bullet point relating to rescuing babies or small children, as we could not find this in CLG guidance. I'm happy to include it if the source is from Firekill's website and or is government advice. I've also removed the word bonding from the RIF, but only the word and not the recommended actions. I think it's the word the Lakanal Board will be uncomfortable with, as this is nowhere in national government guidance. If you have any additional comments, then please let me know ASAP, as the next stop is for it to be forwarded to Training Department for comment before it goes to the OMs. Now, just focusing on that second paragraph there closely, why did you only remove the word bonding but not the actions?
I'm not sure in terms of where it refers to, what the actions were. So when I've removed the words, it says I've not removed the recommended actions, but I'm not sure what those were in the RIF. If you could show me those, I might be able to help a bit more.
Well, just on this email, I'm asking you about your decision to remove only the word and nothing more, because you say, I think it's the word the Lachnal Board will be uncomfortable with.
Yeah.
Why were your amendments so narrow, simply semantic, and not actually addressing the actions?
So just on how I've seen previous RIFs laid out, it might have said try and bond with the caller, and then given some suggested phrases and recommendations, and actually some of the phrases and recommendations might have been in line with what we had agreed at the Lachnal Board, such as the firefighters are on the way, or the firefighters know where you are. So it might have been just that I removed the word bonding and not to bond with the caller, rather than the bullet points. But without seeing it, I can't really be sure.
Right. Well, since you ask, let's look at the actions. Forgive me. It's at LFB 00121240, and help me with this. We'll look at page 12. Let's have them side by side. Actually, that's I think the better approach, so we can actually see what you want to see. If we keep the email on the screen and go to LFB 00121240, page 12. Now, underneath reassure the caller, example guidance, and you see 4 bullet points there. The firefighters are on their way, the firefighters know where you are, the firefighters are there, the firefighters are dealing with a fire. Now, that's your amended guidance, I think, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. So those are the actions. They've not been removed. You only remove the word bonding, as we've seen from the email on the left, yes?
Yes.
Right. Now, given that your gap analysis had identified the fact that the LFB documents were not in line with national guidance because they promoted forming an attachment with the caller, shouldn't you have taken further steps to remove the actions from the RIF as well, or amended them, rather than indulge in what one might call semantic minimalism?
So I understand what I've written there about removing from the RIF, but this has also gone to training department for comment, and to the OMs, and probably a further discussion with myself, Scott, Tim Cutbill and Tom Davies from legal as well. So that is the final version. So there might be some more amendments, and we might have amended it further. The original might have just had something about, as I say, make sure you bond with the caller. And that was something we'd identified in our gap analysis and wanted to remove. It looks like it's been streamlined further to reassure the caller. And I can assure you that those statements were agreed by the legal team that were working on the Lachnal House Inquiry, to make sure that actually they felt that they were good pieces of advice to reassure the caller, but weren't luring them into a false insecurity or weren't false truths.
Yes. But, well, that's the point, isn't it? You just mentioned the nub of this, or the nub of the last sentence of paragraph 2 of 1093, was that CRO should not say anything to callers to lull them into a false sense of security. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. We've
Yes.
seen it. We can
Yes.
go back to it.
I think there is a warning there, yeah.
Yes. That's the point. And therefore bonding, which is just another way of saying getting them to trust you, is one thing. But do you accept that by leaving the example guidance in this fourfold set of examples of reassurance, you were creating or perpetuating a situation where CROs might very well lead a caller into a false sense of security?
As I said, I think the bonding compared to the previous RIF that you've shown me, you can see a drastic reduction in the sentences and the phrases and the phraseology that we had suggested. And those 4 phrases there were agreed by the legal team that they were appropriate to reassure the caller and that they were what we could offer them.
Can we go back to paragraph 39 of your witness statement and the second half of the paragraph I read to you following the review? See that? I read it to you before. Following
Yes.
the review of PM, yes, more limited guidance. And you say at the end there, whilst making only true statements such as the firefighters are on their way. Now, the RIF you created, we've just seen it, and indeed the 2014 version as well, which I haven't shown you, but take from me, doesn't actually tell CROs only to make true statements, does it?
No.
No. Were they ever told only to make true statements? In other words, statements they knew to be true and not to provide false assurances, or rather assurances that they couldn't verify?
Not in terms of do not make untrue statements and only state true statements. I don't believe so. I didn't deliver the training, the content. I do know that we'd removed the bonding from that. But
So just to draw the threads together, there's nothing in the policy that says only make true statements, don't make unverified statements. There's nothing in the RIF to that effect, and there's nothing in the training to that effect. Is that
there may be something in the training. I'm not.
right?
I can't recall everything that was in the training and didn't create the training, but I would imagine there were some discussions, as I've said previous, about not bonding with the caller.
Why not have it in the RIF? After all, this is in the guidance. It's spelt out in paragraph 2 of the national guidance. It's clearly important. Why not spell it out in the RIF just so that no one would be under any illusion about it?
Yes, I think that's probably true, but also with control and call taking, they would probably, even though if it was written in statements, they would want to offer some reassurance to callers. They would want to try and make them feel safe in those sort of situations. So even though if it was written in policy, they might offer statements up. They certainly, control staff were under the impression, even after Lacanau, that, and really evidenced by the number of fire survival guidance calls that we'd had, even after Lacanau, that firefighters would rescue the caller, and the control officers would keep them safe until they arrived.
Yes, it's a matter of assumption, isn't it, rather than fact? You use the word impression. But
Well, like I say, on the evidence after, even or prior to Lacanau, and then after Lacanau, that was never not true.
well, on their way, the firefighters are on their way, may be loosely true, but it may not, in fact, be reliable enough, because the firefighters might be battling their way up a high-rise building, encountering increasing difficulties
Yes,
over time.
yes.
And therefore saying that to a caller stuck high in such a building would offer an increasingly false sense of security, wouldn't it?
Yes, like I said, they were the ones that were discussed and were suitable for control officers to say.
Can I then turn to the question of what to advise a caller once a decision had been made to revoke stay put advice? Can we start with paragraph 69 of your statement, please, at page 26? And this is where you deal with policy 790. The question is at the very head of the page in relation to action 14, creation of policy 790. question, the inquiry understands that you were involved in the development of Policy 790 with Patrick Utting. Please confirm whether this is correct and set out the nature of your involvement. And your answer is, I had some involvement in the development of PN 790 with Patrick Utting after the Lacknell House fire. I reviewed PN 790 from a controlled perspective to ensure that the words and descriptions were accurate. I also recommended that a change of advice given to residents in high-rise buildings should occur and needed to be included in the policy. This work was carried out in 2011 before I was seconded to CFOA. PN 790 was not at that time a shared policy between operational firefighters and control. Now, if we look at PN 790, it's at LFB 000083447. This is the edition of what was, as we know, tagged as, or labelled as draft 155, and this is at February 2011, 10th February 2011. You can see that, still in draft, as you can see from the watermark. If we go to page 4, that says at section 6.6, in exceptional circumstances, an IC may consider informing control that their advice to FSG callers should be altered, i.e. to attempt to leave their property. Was that the sentence that you suggested should be inserted?
Yes.
What did you intend be meant by exceptional circumstances?
I think this was just following our investigations into the Lacknell fire, where I think we realised that we could have advised a caller to leave their building earlier than we did. And it was purely from that we had a discussion about if we might use that in future. And because the board had asked us to go back directly to 1093, that we wanted to make sure that that was in, and that the incident commander understood it may be contravening our national guidance, which we had committed to follow.
Do you remember whether you were party to any discussion about what the ambit or meaning or content of exceptional circumstances should be?
No, and I don't think I came up with the wording. I think from a controls perspective, I acknowledged that we may need to change advice to get callers out of the building. And I certainly think Pat, from an operational perspective, and his work with Policy 790, had realised that too. We were focused on talking about information gathering and information sharing on the incident ground. We'd been really forceful that it should be two-way communication, so we wanted to make sure that that was in. And I think we probably wanted to make sure that there was a piece in there so the incident commander just didn't make that decision on the incident ground but needed to share it with control. So the wording, I don't believe I had any input into, but the meaning of it and what we were trying to achieve, yes, I did.
Right. You said in that last answer, earlier on in the answer, that from a control perspective, I acknowledged that we may need to change advice to get callers out of the building.
Yes.
When you say we, do you mean control?
Yes, I would have meant control.
Yes. So
yes.
Did you have in mind, when you were involved in the amendment of Policy 790, that it would be control who might take the lead in changing that advice from stay put to leave?
Probably. I probably would have thought that because we were talking to callers, we would be aware of their circumstances and following the two-way communications that we thought we were putting in, that we'd be aware of what was happening on the incident ground as well, and would come to that assumption and then share that with the incident commander and have those discussions.
So was your thinking at the time that the decision to revoke stay put and move to get out should be one taken by the control room or the incident ground and shared mutually.
I think they could both contribute to it.
Right.
Yes.
The reason I ask you that is because if you look at the words on the page at 6.6, in exceptional circumstances, an IC may consider informing control that their advice to FSG callers should be altered. It tends to suggest, I think, doesn't it, that it was a decision made by the incident commander.
It does, yes.
Why was that? Why was that language used in the end?
I'm not entirely sure, but I would imagine that they would have thought that it would have been the incident commander that would have all the information there and be able to make that decision, and the control room wouldn't have been.
Right. Now, we know that what happened on the night of the fire, that
Yes.
in fact, you yourself, I think, together with DAC Fenton, came to your own independent decision to revoke stay put.
Yes.
And then you communicated that to the fire ground about the same time that Andy Rowe was doing the same thing there. We know that. Had you ever done that before the night of Grenfell?
No, and I don't think, even though we talked about it and discussed it after Lacanau, that was certainly some of the learning that we'd taken and I'd taken. And whilst we'd put it in policy, I don't think we'd ever foreseen us using it.
Right. And it would follow from that, I think, you'd accept that you never really considered what you would be looking for by way of exceptional circumstances, let alone teaching CROs what they should be looking for by way of exceptional circumstances.
Yes, potentially. I mean, in exceptional circumstances with an IC, I suppose they're like on an instant ground, they would be aware of what exceptional circumstances related to that incident. Certainly, as a Brigade Control Senior Manager, I probably had my own idea of exceptional circumstances. I'm not sure that would have been shared with the control officers. It certainly wouldn't have been a decision I would have expected them to make.
Now, as you say, after Lacanau, this was a possibility, and that explains why it's present in this policy here,
Yes.
in this form, 6.6, albeit a draft at that stage. Did you consider what advice CROs would need to give to callers in order to carry out the new advice, or to give the new advice in practice?
I think we probably thought that actually that would change dependent on the circumstances.
I mean, did you ever consider what it was that CROs should say to callers who called in once stay put had been revoked by the incident commander and you had been told of it?
Not to add into anything, because like I said, I would have thought that depending on the circumstances, the advice that was coming from the incident commander might be different. But from a Brigade Control Senior Manager level, where it would have been one of us that would have made that decision or consider that decision, yes, I would imagine that we would have had some idea of what we were saying, like on the night, and what we were telling people, and we would have instructed control staff to do that. They are, like all ranks and roles in the fire service, understanding of a piece of information and implementing that order or instruction.
Did you consider that guidance might need to be given to CROs either in Policy 539 or in the FSG RIFs?
No, but I think I can't recall having a discussion about that, but maybe because the imminent danger part was in National Guidance 1093, that we collectively said that would cover the exceptional circumstances if a caller was in imminent danger.
Why not amend the RIFs at least in order to contain some set of prompts so that if control had been told by IC that their advice should now be altered so that the caller should attempt to leave their property, the CRO would know what to tell them?
Well, I think because we were conscious that the advice may be different. So they may say that they should use a particular stairwell just for thinking, or, I mean, this is a generic policy, this isn't specifically for high rise. So I think in sometimes, the breaking of the window on the top floor, as you know, FSG calls from the database, our experience of those are from domestic dwelling fires, and therefore the advice to break a window and to jump from the first floor if you were in imminent danger was included in there.
Yeah, but wasn't the RIF, the RIF on FSG, the place to contain prompts so as to cater for this possibility? Because you're dealing with fire survival guidance, whether from a high-rise or anywhere else, I accept that it's generic in that sense, but given that the RIFs were all about fire survival guidance, wasn't that the place to have in one or two prompts about what it is that the call handler should tell the caller about leaving, about how to bring it home to them? They would have to leave.
Yes. On reflection, yes.
And why wasn't it in there, do you know?
Because I don't think we thought of those extreme circumstances, and that, like I say, the imminent danger and the wording that we'd put in, is there anything you can think of to get you out of that property, was a start of that conversation.
Can we just look at your police statement? Right, you say it's the start of the conversation. Can we just look at your police statement at MET 000-80606, page 13, second paragraph down, about 4 lines down from the start of that. You say, and you've cited the part of the draft from 790 about the changed guidance. And then you say, CROs do not have training around this potential change, as we did not envisage that this would be necessary, particularly on the scale of the fire at Grenfell Tower. Now, leaving aside for a moment whether you envisaged a fire on the same scale as occurred at Grenfell, given that you had inserted this paragraph into the policy, why didn't you envisage that it would be necessary even in a rare situation?
I don't think I had the knowledge or the background in terms of my understanding of high-rise buildings and compartmentation to know what we would be advising, what would be the best to advise a caller.
And if you go to the top of the page, you can see in the last line before the end of the paragraph there, you say, this is an FSG policy for operational firefighters, and this policy was never designed to be used by control room staff. What was the point of having a policy aimed at firefighters based on what CROs might do in exceptional circumstances, particularly if you never trained the CROs on what they were to do when those circumstances arose?
Well, policy 790 was another request from the Lakanal House investigation, and was to provide firefighters an explanation about what a fire survival guidance call was and the actions to take when receiving that information on the incident ground, and then focused on the communication and the two-way communication that should happen between the control room and the incident ground. So it was an all-encompassing policy to share with the operational staff what to do on the incident ground when receiving a fire survival guidance call.
Yes, I understand that. But when the information comes back from the incident ground that the advice to callers should be changed and they should now be told to leave, why not develop training to assist the CROs if that happened?
Well, I agree, and I think we've done in previous, we've gone on the experience of the previous fire survival guidance and how many fire survival guidance calls we take to a domestic property and train for that escape from a window and that immediate danger alert, and helping them escape from a domestic dwelling. and not a high-rise building.
Different topic, Supervisor Riff. LFB 0012288, please. This is the Fire Survival Guidance Supervisor Riff. And if you look at the heading 1.1, Initial Supervisor Action, there's a prompt there at the very head of the page, and then the text under that title. If circumstances allow, supervisor or nominated person to support and assist the CRO by monitoring the call and ensuring that, and then there's a series of things to be ensured. That's also repeated in Appendix 3 of Policy 539, isn't it? We can go to it if you like, but I think it is, isn't it?
Yes, it is, yes.
Now, that's the background. Can we look at Vic Bagnall's statement, please, at LFB 001222821, page 6, paragraph 20. And he says there, the approach to receiving and managing FSG calls is that a supervisor is allocated to each call handler receiving an FSG call. Ordinarily, there would be 3 supervisors on duty who would have a number of other responsibilities during their shifts. Would you agree, looking at that the intention of the RIF was for a supervisor to be allocated to each CRO handling an FSG call?
Yes, to provide support, yes, and guidance, and that was from our Lacanau investigations as well.
And would you agree that the policy could not have worked in practice if the number of FSG calls coming in exceeded the number of supervisors available at any time?
No, I think the supervisors are there, in my opinion, the supervisors are there to provide support and guidance, and the control officer has a RIF, or there is another, usually another control room officer that can support them as well. I wouldn't have said it was unusual that a supervisor could monitor 2 fire survival guidance calls if they were sitting next to them, obviously depending on the location in the control room. It would depend on how they would monitor them. They could be sat next to them, or they could go round and plug their headset in and listen directly with the supervisor or with the control officer, or they could monitor from the audio positions at the back of the room. It would entirely depend on the situation, but I would say if you had 2 or 3 fire survival guidance calls, one supervisor could undertake that task with a CRO, but our CROs also receive fire survival guidance training in what to do. I think the original aim of this was from the Lacanau House fire, where when Lindsay came into the room, she monitored the call taker talking to an FSG caller, and actually we thought maybe she would be in a better position supervising the strategic responsibilities of the room, and a supervisor could have undertook that role, and that's where that came from. It was a support, really.
So, in that answer, is the thrust of your point that the policy did work in practice, or would have worked in practice, if the number of FSG calls received, or at least received concurrently, exceeded the number of supervisors, because supervisors could divide their attention equally between 2 CROs taking FSG calls?
Yes.
Were they ever trained to do that?
No, but they are trained to support the control room as supervisors every day with a variety of different calls that came in, and they might have 1 or 2 CROs that need answers to questions and information at one time, and that's actually part of a skill of a control room officer, and especially a supervisor, that you do have some different, you are able to take in information and concurrent information going on from callers and information being passed to you at the same time, and process that. That's what makes you a very good control supervisor, because on a daily basis you are monitoring and overhearing calls and conversations that happen in the room between 10 people or 10 call takers. So that's part of a skill. So it would be fairly normal for a supervisor to support a control officer taking an FSG call and mobilise or carry out additional actions, or support two control officers taking FSG calls.
But I think the answer to my question is no. There was no training given to supervisors in how to support a call handler taking an FSG call if they have to divide their time between one such call handler and another.
Not specifically FSG calls. I was just trying to explain that just happens. That is just the role of a supervisor in the control room, and they would have received experiential training on a daily basis to do that.
Have you seen any policy or any training or any RIF that would suggest that on occasions a supervisor might have to be allocated to more than one call handler handling an FSG call?
No.
No. See, we haven't either, and I just wonder whether we've missed something. It doesn't seem to be part of the expectation that would ever happen.
Well, I think in the past, in some of the incidents that you've shown me where we have received a number of FSG calls, that must have occurred, because we may have only had 3 supervisors on with 6 FSG calls, so that, and obviously someone needs to be there to carry out the supervisory action. So they would have always been multitasking.
So let's see if we can get an example. You say 6. Is that the Adair Tower fire, 31st October 2015?
Yes.
So does that tell us that those 6 FSG calls were concurrent?
No, it doesn't. It was just an example I was given that actually a supervisor is more than capable of supporting a control officer, giving FSG guidance, and undertaking other roles and tasks. And one of them could be listening to another call.
Do you remember whether at the Adair Tower fire, with those, you say 6 FSG calls, the records suggest 9, doesn't matter for present purposes, do you remember whether the supervisors on duty were dividing their monitoring time between different CROs handling different FSG calls?
No, I don't, but I would imagine they may well have done. I certainly have done it when I've been in the room, when we've been dealing with an incident where we've taken 2 or 3 fire survival guidance calls to add support.
Did the experience of Lakanal in July 2009, or the Marriott fire in November 2010, or perhaps even the Adair Tower fire in October 2015 not prompt you to consider whether your rostering of CROs and supervisors needed to change in order to cater for the risk of what I might call a mass FSG incident?
In terms of increasing...
In terms of making sure that you had enough supervisors so that you could pursue what I might call best practice, namely the allocation of one supervisor to one control room operator handling an FSG call.
Yes, I think we did. I'm not sure when it increased to 4 supervisors on the watch. I believe that was a decision taken by AC Tom George, although he might have been the deputy at the time.
Right, would that have been in 2016?
Possibly.
Right.
But maybe in 2017 there was some adjustment to increase the supervisory role in control.
Was that in contemplation of an increased risk of higher numbers of concurrent FSG calls?
No, I don't believe so, because I think, as I've said before, if we didn't have sufficient supervisors, or supervisors weren't able to support the control officer because of mass FSG calls, then we would handle the FSG calls, and our arrangements with our buddy control rooms and BT would be able to make sure the other calls to an incident or other incidents were answered.
Did you ever discuss with anybody, such as Scott Hayward or Dave Brown or Tom George, that your policy of, at least in writing, of allocating one supervisor to one CRO handling an FSG call was never going to work in practice if a mass FSG event happened?
No, because I don't think we ever foresaw a mass FSG incident.
Well, was Lacknell House not a mass FSG event? Multiple FSG calls?
Well, again, that was the result, and as I've explained, that's why we said a control supervisor could assist, because whilst Lacknell, if you term it a mass FSG incident, all three supervisors were available whilst they were undertaking other tasks, and we identified that one of them could have been available to support one of the control officers taking a prolonged FSG call. So I think that was recognised, and that's why, as a collective, we said that supervisors could support the control officers given FSG, and given them some guidance and some training on that.
Can I ask you to look, please, at Vic Bagnall's statement, LFB 001228221, page 7, paragraph, the paragraph we were on, in fact. And he says there, at the top of the page, third line from the end of the paragraph, there were resourcing issues at control that did not allow for a supervisor to be allocated to each call handler when receiving multiple FSG calls, particularly if these were received during a night duty. Do you agree with that?
Do I agree there were resourcing issues at control? Yes. Yes.
Well, do you agree with everything he's written in that sentence I've just read out to you?
Yes, just
Yes.
through our staffing and the shift pattern that had been introduced with 10 overnight, then yes, had we taken 3 or 4 FSG calls, then a supervisor wouldn't be able to monitor each one.
What were the resourcing issues?
Staffing.
Did you ever go to Scott Hayward or AC Dave Brown or AC Chandler or AC George and say, we've got a staffing problem? We can't, we haven't got enough resources to allow for a supervisor to be allocated to each call handler when receiving multiple FSG calls?
Not in relation to multiple FSG calls, but just in relation to resourcing and control, yes.
You did?
Yes.
In general, but not in relation to FSG calls?
Not specifically in relation to FSG calls, but in issues in resourcing in general, specifically when I was in charge of the OST team with resourcing, but that didn't sit, it wasn't just the OST team, it would have been staffing in general at control. We'd had periods of time where we hadn't been able to recruit. We'd had a mechanism that didn't allow us to recruit as soon as we identified that someone was leaving, and we'd had a number of temporary posts that all had an impact in staffing, and we'd had and dealt with some incidents where we'd recognised that an increase in staffing would be beneficial, but not in specifically related to multiple FSG, no.
Why not?
Just because it had been raised previously, and we deal with a significant amount of other incidents where the impact of resourcing had been noticed, so and it hadn't been with multiple FSG calls, I can only presume.
From your perspective, Ms. Smith, was this a question of the LFB's priorities?
Yes.
Now, when you came back from the CFOA in January 2015, did you do anything to ensure that the CROs and supervisors reviewed and familiarised themselves with the RIFs?
Not that I can recall, but I was aware, I think, that we'd moved to deliver some supervisory training, and that the supervisor RIF had been created, and they had, yeah.
Yes. Well, let's look at a document. I think we saw this before. LFB 000041763. Now, this is a training record for all FSG training from 2011 to 2018. We haven't looked at it in this phase, but we've seen this before, I think. But is this document familiar to you?
Yes, I have seen it.
Yes. Can you tell us what it is?
It was something I believe we were requested to do by LFB Health and Safety, which was to document every member of staff. We had a record for joining control and then their training in fire survival guidance.
Now, we've examined this document, and forgive me for this impressionistic question, but it suggests that not all CROs and supervisors were recorded as having reviewed the FSG RIFs in 2012 and 2013, and there's nothing recorded after 2013 in it. Now, what I've just said is what we've gleaned from the document, but does that sound right to you?
Have you got an example? So are you looking at, there's a block of empty blocks in there. So it takes, from when it started back in 2011, when we first rolled out the refresher training.
Yes.
But obviously it includes all our members of staff that had joined and have joined since. So maybe some of those staff hadn't joined in 2010, 2011, and then it actually only catches up with their training when they joined, maybe in the latter part of 2016, 2017, looking at some of the names where it's blank.
Well, rather than getting bogged down in the detail of the document, can I ask it a different way? Do you know what was done, from your recollection, at least in 2012, when you were still at control, to ensure that all staff familiarised themselves with the FSG RIFs that you'd amended in the previous year?
No, apart from the email.
Right. Was there any plan in place that specified that existing staff must refamiliarise themselves with the RIFs at regular intervals?
No, and I don't know if that was a feature of the training, but not from my email that I sent out. It just asked everyone that was employed at that time to familiarise themselves with it.
And the email you're referring to is the one of the 23rd of February 2011, I think?
Yes, I believe so.
When you came back to control in January 2015 and headed up training, did you do anything to make sure that CROs and supervisors did familiarise themselves with the RIFs as they stood?
No, but like I say, I think I'd seen or been told that they had had some specific training in RIFs or in the CRO and supervisor RIF.
And who told you that?
Probably Scott Hayward.
Right. Given the relative infrequency of FSG calls, so that you couldn't expect CROs necessarily to gather expertise through repeated exposure to FSG calls, why not do something to make sure that they were well on top of the content of the RIFs?
But I think FSG is just one RIF. Like I say, it is a prompt to access if you need support during a call. But also we have a number of RIFs. I'm not sure how many we have, but I would take a guess of about 100 RIFs, all containing different information relating to I think we're close to 100 incident types that control officers deal with. So FSG is one of those that they can access, but there is lots more that they might need to access as well to help them and assist them, such as a CBRN incident with stay safe advice. There could be a range of them. And I was told that they had had specific training in FSG, RIF, the year previous, I believe, but it might have been a bit longer.
Thank you. Is that a convenient moment, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, I think it is. Thank you very much. Well, Ms. Smith, we'll stop now for some lunch. We'll come back, please, at 2 o'clock. And as I've asked you before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it over the break. All right?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Would you go to the usher then, please? Thank you. 2 o'clock then, please. Okay.